What'd you say? 767?
767.
767. This is another jump start from Roger, or bits and pieces, and kind of piecemeal together. I like the idea. It fit in with tonight's lesson pretty good. Some of the verses. I've titled it "If You Had Known," and in Luke 19:41 through 42, it says, "Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, If you had known, even you, especially in this your day, the things that make for your peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." And of course, this is Jesus entering Jerusalem, and he has an appointment to make it at the cross. He is on his way into Jerusalem for that meeting, that purpose that he is to serve. And as he drew near, he wept, but it's not necessarily him weeping for himself. He wasn't, scared of what he had to deal with, what was coming his way, the pain that he had to endure. But he was weeping for the hardship that was to come on those that reject him. We kind of touched on that tonight in the lesson. And there was a couple of verses before or later in verse 21 that you read that are very similar. Jesus knew what the citizens did not. He is not limited by time. He knew what was going to happen. Of course, he knew what was going to happen to him, but he also knew what was fixing to happen in Jerusalem. He knew what was going to happen to those that rejected him, what was going to happen to that city. And in Luke 19:43 and 44, it says, "For days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation." You have to think, would they have treated Jesus differently had they had known? They were given the opportunity to know. They were, they had miracles. They had those things that we're not privileged to experience, and they didn't. But what would happen if they had known? And think about our lives. When we look at situations different in our lives? Have we kind of known the situation or known the outcome? And I think you'd be foolish to say that you would do all the same things in your life if you kind of saw, what the outcome was going to be, or what the circumstances were, if things were a little clearer at the moment. But a lot of times we don't have that opportunity. That's not something that we have. Would you have avoided harsh comments, maybe to someone, if you had known the situation they were in, or what they had gone through that day, or what's going on in their family, or what's going on in their work? We overlook what's going on in other people's lives. We just take that for granted because obviously we know what's going on in our lives, but we make a quick judgment, based upon that 1 second evaluation. We look at them and go, and make that judgment, maybe say something harsh, maybe say something to hurt their feelings, something a lot of times that we're going to regret and be sorry about, and ask forgiveness, ask for repentance on those things, hoping that you don't do that again. The old foot in the mouth thing, that's happened to me more than once, and I'm sure it's going to happen in the future. You try for that not to happen, but inevitably it does happen. They have that phrase, walk a mile in my shoes. It's and you really can't. You can say, well, you just deal with what I'm dealing with. Well, you really can't. In the business that I'm in healthcare, you try to analyze pain, and you try to figure out source of pain and what makes that pain better. But as far as feeling what that person feels, that pain level, that it's impossible. You have an idea because you've been through some pain and some hardship on your own, but to really understand that person's pain, you really cannot. And we need to kind of think about that. If we really know what they're going through, it's impossible for us to know what's going on in people's lives just by, just that snapshot that we see. Maybe we see them, some of the people within our group, we see them once a week. Some people we see all three, if we're here all 3 days a week. And, it's easy to place judgment. You kind of put yourself in that chair, and you're like, well, just based upon this, and this, I'm going to say it's this, not really knowing what's going on in their lives. So there's a couple of points I would like to make regarding that. Often we don't know. And I'm going to tell you more than not, we don't know what's going on in people's lives. We can ask people what's going on. And I'm going to tell you, at work, people say, "Hey, how's it going?" You know what your response is? "Fine, it's good." And you move on. And I'm going to tell you, a lot of times that's not the honest response. You may have something, going on with your family. You may have something going on with your own health. You may have something going on, mentally, something that you're struggling with. Maybe some sort of sin is trying to creep in and you're struggling with that. But that fact alone, the fact that we really don't know what's going on in other people's lives, it should cause us to be less judgmental and more helpful. As opposed, if we see somebody who's not their norm, are we going to jump on the bandwagon and beat them down? Is that our job, or is our job to be, hey, noticed, you're not yourself. Is everything okay? And be honest and be kind. And if they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to talk about it. But if they want to talk about it, then there's an opportunity for them. And maybe you can pray together, and maybe you can help them through that situation. Say, for instance, when someone comes in late to service or doesn't come to class or, doesn't come to our scheduled services, do we roll our eyes? Do we shake our heads? Do we let out a sigh, and go, again, can they not get here on time? Is that what we do? And it's not our job. Maybe we take a moment to realize that we're not the judge, jury, and executioner in that situation. That's not our job to do that. We need to be happy that they're here if they do come in late. Or maybe someone shows up to class that normally doesn't show up to class. Do we take the opportunity to go and say, "Hey, good to see you at class"? Did we take that 1 second and go, maybe they appreciated that. Or they may, if nobody says that, maybe they say, "Nobody even noticed I was there or missing, so I'm just not going back. I'm going to stay the norm." So take the opportunities where you have the opportunities to be thankful, and be thankful that they are there, that they are with us. Because I'm going to tell you, people have the opportunity to do a lot of things in this world other than come and sing praises and pray and be with like-minded Christians. The world is yanking at them in 100 different directions. Just so the fact that they're here, that's a win. It's a win. Maybe that person worked all night, or maybe they stopped on the way to help somebody. I've had my dealings where I've stopped and changed tires. Maybe all of you have. I don't know, and been late or missed things. Maybe they had car trouble, or maybe they just did get up late, because that's happened to all of us too. Maybe they slept through that alarm, and maybe they needed that sleep. But at least they made the effort and came on. We're not the judge. We have to leave that up to God, because God is a perfect judge, and He knows what's in their heart. And it's not for me to decide. It's really not. And a lot of times we head down that path, and we shouldn't. We need to think about it before we roll our eyes or say something or, talk about it. We don't need to do that. Number two, it's really not our business to know. We don't get to hand out tickets for God. We don't get to go back there and say, "You know what? You were late. Here's your ticket. God wanted me to give this to you. Don't let it happen again, because you're going to get too many points. We're not going to let you back in the building." That's not what should happen. It's not my business. So what if they come in late? They came in, like I said earlier. There are a lot of places they could be besides here. And if they missed a service or two, are we reaching out to them and saying, "Are you okay? Can we just send a text?" How long does that take? Speak it in the phone and send it on. It's not our job to ask them questions, possibly making them feel worse. After church, do we go up and say, "Yeah, see, you were late again. What happened? Again? What happened?" And I'm going to tell you, if we do get that information, what are we going to do with it? What you going to do with that information? It doesn't matter. And I'm going to tell you what we are going to do. We're going to tell others. Or you're not going to believe old Bobby slept in again. He stayed up all night long watching sports, and he couldn't get up again. What you can do with that information? Nothing. Tell others. And I'm going to tell you there's a fine line between being helpful to those that are trying to attend and trying to be closer to God, and crossing that line and just being nosy, and being troublesome and gossiping. There's a fine line there. We want to stay on the helpful side. Be positive. Don't beat somebody down. We want to be positive. So we need to be reaching out to those people who aren't here. Shoot them a text. If they're normally here, shoot them a text. And if they're not here, shoot them a text anyway and say, hey, love to see you on Wednesday. Because we got a lot of empty chairs that we could fill on Wednesday night for our study. And we all need it. The last thing anybody wants to do is feel uncomfortable. Having to come to you and report to you about their attendance and their dress and their behavior during worship. Nobody wants to be called out. This is, they have, people say this is a safe space. This should be the safest space of all. It really should. This should be where nobody's going to point a finger at you or turn up their nose or scoff at you. This needs to be the safest place. 'Cause I'm going to tell you, this is the safest place in my life. It is. And I have a wonderful life. But I've often said, if I'm going to die, I'd just soon die at church. If I'm going to go, that's where I want to go. If it's going to happen like that. When I first started getting up here, either whether it was leading singing or, doing these Wednesday night talks or preaching, you look out there and you see a lot of stuff going on, and it sometimes used to bother me, that, well, he's napping again. You see all that stuff. I'm going to tell you, I've sat that chair and napped myself. If I've cut grass all day and I, this, that, and the other, and I sit there and, I'm not going to argue. I've napped myself. Or you see kids and they got their heads down the entire, if I preach a 30-minute lesson and that kid doesn't look up for 30 minutes. And I know they're not reading the Bible during that 30 minutes. But they're here. That stuff used to bother me, but they're here. If you're going to doze here. That's okay. You're here. I'm glad you're here. That stuff doesn't bother me, and it shouldn't. And it shouldn't bother any of us because they're here. They're here with us. I most never know what happens, as far as, some people say that church, nobody does anything there. Nobody does anything, being judgmental of, others, what they're doing, what they're not doing in that kind of business, but I'm going to tell you, phone calls, visits, cards, food, invites, all those things happen. I've received cards. I've received phone calls. I've received food. And I'd almost guarantee that all of you have from this group. But I don't know. The only time I really know it really goes on is when I'm getting it. So I know when that happens. But there's a lot of stuff that goes on within this group that you don't realize. So don't be judgmental of others. Be thankful that we're here and thankful of those people that are working. Those things happen during the week, and it's easy to sit back and think nothing's going on. And I'm going to tell you, maybe you need to evaluate your own work. If you want to spend your time doing something, evaluate your own work, because that's going to be helpful to you, and it's going to be helpful to those that you know. Sit back and evaluate that, not what everybody else is doing. That's where your focus needs to be. And then James 1:23-24, it says, "For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man observing his natural face in a mirror. For he observes himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of a man he was." We need to realize, if we're not just a Christian when we're in this house, when we're in this building, we're Christian 24 hours a day. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. I think the biggest, if you had known could be said of the blessings of God? Do we really realize all of the blessings that God does for us? Would we be more faithful if we realized? Just like when he was entering Jerusalem. If they had known, would they have changed? If we truly realize, are we going to be more faithful? And we should be. We need to think about those blessings, those people that God has put in your life, and more importantly, those people that he's kind of kept out of your life. Those people that could have caused you harm and led you down the wrong path. He played a role in that too. And I'm going to tell you, I don't understand how it all works together, because it's so far ahead of me. He's already got it planned out, the situations. It's up to you to make those choices. But I'm going to tell you, you're faithful to him, he will be faithful to you. The doors that have opened, the prayers answered, and we talked about this earlier, the angels who may have tended to us, or we've had the opportunity to tend to. We don't know. We don't know. But if we would have known, would we be more faithful? So think about those blessings. God has done more than we will ever know for us in our lives. And we may not figure it out for years. And sadly, we might not ever figure it out, the wonderful things he's done for us, looking at all the things that lined up in our lives correctly. In Romans 8:28, it reads, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." They work together. And God's got a plan for each one of those faithful Christians. He's got a plan. And he wants you to stay faithful. And he's going to help you stay faithful. He's going to do that for you. So I'll talk to you this is my personal life, just for a second, about realizing if you had known, and how God kind of, arranged for me to have a great outcome. So most of you know I've had both of my hips done. But my first hip I had done in February of 2021. I went to see a doctor who told me I needed 2 hip replacements, which was kind of a smack in the face, because I just thought I was going in there for a cleanup. I needed more than a cleanup. So I just kind of went home and kind of stewed on that for a little bit. And she told me, that physician told me that I could get shots in my hips. That would help. So I set up for that, and I got a couple of shots in my hips, and I felt great for about a week and a half. And then I didn't feel good at all. So in May, that was April, I got those shots. After getting those shots, you have to wait 3 months before any kind of replacement, because it's a steroid. So they can't do surgery on you for 3 months. So in May, I happened to run into a friend of mine at the hospital. I was going up. He was in the hallway. And I had a picture of my x-ray on my phone. I said, "Hey, look at this." He goes, "Oh, it's pretty bad." He goes, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I talked to this lady in Nashville who does hips. I'm going to get this hip done." And he goes, "Have you thought about a BHR, which is a Birmingham hip resurfacing," which is what I have. And I said, "No, I haven't done much thinking about it, because the physicians in Lebanon didn't do it. The physicians in Nashville didn't do it. No one really wanted to do that surgery. But my friend was the rep for Smith & Nephew, who makes this BHR. And he said, there's a new doctor that just got out of fellowship at Summit who does these things. And he has done 2 already, and they have done fantastic, and it's for active people." Now, my friend who I saw in the hallway, had I been 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, I wouldn't have seen him. It wouldn't have happened. I wouldn't have made contact with him. And that fella also used to work for another company called Biomet, selling those prosthetics also, that inserts knees and hips and things like that. He had a 1-year non-compete clause where he couldn't be in Lebanon or the Nashville area. He had just gotten off of that, and he was back in the area. And there he was. And there this doctor was who just got out of fellowship in Texas. And that doctor, I went and talked to him. That doctor trained under a physician in Texas who loved doing these BHRs. So he had the opportunity to train under this guy who had done hundreds of these BHRs. And in 2021, I had my first one, and it's done fantastic. But you think if just one of those pieces were changed, I don't know that I would have the outcome that I have. And it's taken me probably maybe four or 5 years to realize all the pieces that had to fall into place for that to happen. God is working for you, and he works for me, and he works for all those people that love him and worship him. He works for them, and he will work for you. I appreciate you listening. If anyone is in need of the invitation of prayers, of something we can do for them, we ask that you don't hesitate, don't wait, come forward while we stand and sing the song selected.
Who at the door is standing?